The legacy of colonialism in Australia and Canada is a complex and painful history. One of the most significant impacts of colonialism has been the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities. In Canada, residential schools operated by the government and Christian churches were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture, resulting in the loss of language, culture, and identity. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it is estimated that between 4,000 and 6,000 Indigenous children died while attending these schools. In Australia, the forced removal of Indigenous children, also known as the Stolen Generations, had similarly devastating impacts on Indigenous communities. Children were forcibly taken from their families and communities and placed in institutions or with non-Indigenous families, resulting in the loss of culture, language, and identity. The impacts of these policies continue to be felt today, as generations of Indigenous peoples have struggled with the intergenerational trauma and loss of culture and identity. Despite the oppression, Indigenous peoples in Australia and Canada have engaged in resistance and solidarity movements to defend their rights and fight for justice. These movements have taken many forms, including protests, legal challenges, and direct action. In Australia, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, established in 1972, has been a significant site of resistance against colonialism and racism. The Tent Embassy has been a place of protest, negotiation, and community organizing for Indigenous peoples and their allies. In Canada, the Idle No More movement, founded in 2012, mobilized Indigenous peoples and their allies to resist government policies that threatened Indigenous lands and sovereignty. The movement used social media to organize protests, rallies, and other actions to raise awareness about the impacts of colonialism on Indigenous communities. Multinational corporations have played a significant role in perpetuating neocolonialism and exploitation in Australia and Canada. These corporations have benefited from the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and their lands, often with little regard for their human rights or the environmental impacts of their actions. One example is the Adani coal mine in Queensland, Australia. The mine has faced significant opposition from Indigenous communities and environmental activists. Due to its potential to destroy the ancestral lands, waters, and cultures of Indigenous peoples in the region. Despite these concerns, the project has been supported by the Australian government. The impacts of climate change and environmental degradation have had significant impacts on Indigenous communities in Australia and Canada. Indigenous peoples in both countries have long been stewards of the land and have developed sustainable practices that can help mitigate the impacts of climate change. However, these communities have also been disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation, including the impacts of resource extraction and the destruction of natural habitats. International organizations, such as the United Nations and human rights organizations, have played a critical role in addressing war crimes and human rights abuses in Australia and Canada. These organizations provide a framework for holding governments and individuals accountable for their actions and for advocating for justice and accountability. To move forward, it is important to listen to and center the voices and experiences of those who have been impacted by these issues, particularly Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities. Ongoing education and awareness raising among the broader public is also essential in addressing the issues of imperialism, war crimes, and human rights abuses in Australia and Canada.